My name is Miro. I'm a faculty member here at the MIT Sloan School of Management. I teach in our Management Communications department, where I specialize in communicating about data. But my career prior to this was in sales and client service primarily. I see a bunch of familiar faces here. Who was at the prior session? Just so I have a reminder. Okay, so most of you here were at the prior session before. I'm going to call out Carlo. You weren't, but Carlo is a student of mine. He's in my communications class, so I feel totally comfortable cold calling on you because as we do that for a grade. Obviously, this is a reasonably small session, so feel free to ask questions as we go through. I have a little bit of a plan, but I don't feel super tied to it. The plan is probably an hour to an hour and a half of content, and then I'll be able to stay until 3 p.m. to answer any additional questions. So if you have one-off questions or specific questions, we'll have time for that at the end as well. You don't have to stay for it, but you can. Today's focus is on qualifying. In general, this series is designed as an introductory series. So it's designed as a series for those of you who don't have prior experience in sales. Particularly, I've geared this around folks who might have experience in engineering and are founders and are finding yourself in a sales situation for the first time. And this class is about, this series is about some very basic foundational concepts in sales that I found really helpful early in my career to understand what I was doing to speed me up and to make me more effective. And so the one we're going to talk about today is the idea of qualifying. So in the sales process, I think I will pose as a hypothetical that we can agree to. The thing we would most want to hear from customers about whether or not they want to buy is yes. That would be our highest priority. And the thing we'd most want to hear. What would be this? This is a question often asked at sales training. They say, oh, yes is what we all want to hear. What's the second best thing to hear? No. No. Yeah, so people who've heard this line before. The second best thing to hear is a no. Why is, sorry, and then what's the worst thing you could hear? Maybe. Yeah. So yes is best, no is better, maybe is the worst. Why is a no better than a maybe?
Because then you don't have to waste your time and resources on the thing where you're just like, bye.
Yeah. So a no lets us not waste our time and resources. And sales is a process of managing time. That is the one factor that you have that you can control in the sales process, which is how you spend your time. You don't have a great deal of control over how your prospects behave. So we have to think about how do we spend our time, how do we allocate it well, and how do we use it efficiently. Today is a lot about thinking about how to make sure that you're spending your time with appropriate people who can buy. So if yes is best, and no is not so bad, I want you to get used to the idea that maybe is terrible. And there's a lot of things that we spend time trying to do to get people into this category. The biggest one that I want to talk about today is to make sure you are spending your time on people who are qualified. And we're going to talk a little bit about what qualified means. And we're going to do an exercise to help you think about this for your business. The basics of qualification, there's a couple of different ones that people use, but the acronym that I was introduced to, and a really common one you'll find, is the acronym of BANT. Then in order to be qualified, by definition, a prospect must meet all 4 of these tests that can be expressed as BANT. And so the first one is that they must have budget. They must be able to afford whatever it is that you are selling. The next one is that they must have authority. They must have the ability to say yes to whatever it is that you are selling. So you see how this starts getting to specific people, because there could be an organization that has budget, but you may not be talking to a person that has authority to be able to make the purchase decision. These are very basic, but this is just a checklist to get your mind around. The next one is even more important, and that sometimes people forget, which is they need to have a need. We talked in the first session a lot about pain and about what are the different pains that buyers have versus users versus reviewers, and the need to make sure that you're selling against some sort of pain or need that the buyer has. And then the last one, and the one we spend a lot of time on in sales, is timing. They need to have some sort of time pressure that's going to cause them to buy this product. So I'm going to talk to you about what this looked like. Spend time on the qualified. A couple of businesses that I worked at. And in particular, what I want to think about is, okay, for these, what are some of the signs that we are talking to someone or an organization that meets these qualities? And what are some of the questions that we can ask to try and get at this information so that we're not spending our time working on unqualified people? To give you a sense of this, my brother used to do phone sales, and he was rather famous around his office. I forget if I said this last time, that when people didn't have budget, he would hang up on them mid-call. He was selling to like mid-sized business, he was selling to like contractors and individual business owners where there was thousands of them, and they were all over the country, and he would just end the call mid-call. And he was, I thought it was an asshole move, but he was very proud of this because he's like, look, I do 20% more calls every day than all of the other salespeople because I really do not waste my time on anyone who is unqualified. So that's your most extreme example. I'm not advocating it as a business practice, but I am saying importance of keeping to the discipline of this. So we'll do it vertically here. So budget, authority, need, and timing. So the startup that I worked for, told you about last time, this company Testive, we sold SAT preparation. So this was sold to families with high school students who were preparing for the SAT, which is the test that American students take to get into college. And the price point for our product was about $2,000 per student. So one of the first things and most important things we would try to qualify in would be budget. So one of the things you could potentially ask, and in some cases we did, is do you have $2,000 to spend on this? But people's often initial response to questions about budget is they'll give you the maybe. So you need to think about questions that, or other information that could help you get it. What do you imagine are some questions, not that decide whether or not this person definitely has this money available, but suggest that this person might be qualified, might have the budget available? What are some things that you would think about or look at?
Previous buyer in this category.
Yep. So it's interesting. This is a category where there didn't tend to be previous purchases. There didn't tend to be previous purchases of SAT prep because it was a thing you only tended to do once. But there were some related things. What do you imagine some related things? Yeah, exactly. So if they'd spent money previously, oh, have you worked with tutors or people like that in the past for your student? So we'd ask about prior similar purchases. Other ideas, Carter?
It might be intrusive, but asking if they plan to apply for financial aid or scholarships.
Yep.
That could indicate that money is more of a concern.
Yeah, and it was a thing that cut both ways. That was true. If people planned to apply for scholarships, it was often helpful because if they did, then they often needed to have a certain target score. So actually what that question tended to be more helpful with was actually about need. Because if they were applying for scholarships, then that suggested they needed to get a certain score in order to be able to qualify for them. So we did use that question. And part of the sales comfort is getting comfortable asking these questions in a way that doesn't feel threatening to people. And this is where a lot of the art comes in, which is to ask them with genuine curiosity. Oh, are you looking at any other scholarships, or are you applying for any scholarships for your student? What else? What else might be a signal?
What schools are they applying to?
What schools are they applying to, and how would you think about that as a signal?
In terms of
What answers would you be looking for to suggest whether or not they're qualified?
yeah, I mean, just in terms of like relative tuition, right?
Yeah. So if people tended to be looking at private schools, that was an example of qualification. Yep, in-state, out-of-state. I'll give you a couple of other ones that were super reliable, weirdly enough. Actually, an easy one in this case was, what city do you live in? If they lived in Newton or Wellesley, it was probably pretty likely that they were qualified in the sense of that they likely had budget. The other one that was super reliable, we worked with a lot of student athletes. There were certain sports that did not indicate whether or not you were qualified, but there were certain sports that definitely indicated you were qualified. If you played water polo, it was very high likelihood that SAT prep was something that you could afford. If you played horse polo, you definitely were qualified to be able to buy our product. These are stereotypes. And part of what we use them for in sales is not to be able to make evaluative judgments of good or bad, but to help us think about where we're going to spend our time by looking at what sort of qualities our prospects are likely to share. So that was budget. Authority, I talked about last time. This was easy. If we were talking to the student and a teenager, they did not have authority to make the purchase decision. We needed to be talking to a parent. It was one we only had to ask if we were confused. Sometimes we would be like, so tell us about yourself, and they'd say they were 16, and we'd say, can we speak to your parents? So authority there was parent. Need. So this was interesting. Financial aid was something we asked about to establish need. What else? Imagine when you think about to establish need for SAT prep.
The target schools?
Yeah, exactly, yep. Target schools. And then finally, timing. Oh, question.
Yeah, there's a question.
Yeah.
GPA.
Yeah.
Intuitively, you would think a grade 8 student
Yeah.
would be very interested in prep, but the lower GPAs would need it.
Yeah.
Who would your buyer end up being? Were they top performers or low?
Yeah. So we always asked about GPA. And again, you're thinking about this right, which is to try and think about what are questions that are potentially easy for the prospect to answer that you can get some degree of information on. We would often ask about GPA. And the way we would use that information, you can think about how this applies in your business, is actually what was their GPA? What sorts of schools were they looking at? And we would use that to be able to say, oh, with that GPA, targeting those schools, here is roughly the kinds of scores that people with those GPAs tend to need to get into the school. And so then if you had a practice test, you'd be able to say, oh, well, you're a really high-performing student. It doesn't look like your test scores reflect how high-performing you are. You might want to consider investing in prep. So all of these things that dance around where the need in the business might be and what sort of problems people have. And simply understanding, in this case, like how their business works, what are the different levers, and it can help you get at need. Finally, timing. This sale was nice because it had some external timing. What do you think some of the big timing questions were we'd ask about? Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, these were critical things that you can't know ahead of time, but we had to ask, which is what grade are you in? If you were a freshman, we would say, I'm sorry, we don't think our services are a very good, if your child was a freshman, we'd say, I'm sorry, we don't think your services are a very good fit for us. That would end the conversation with most people. And some people would push back and say, no, I want to buy it now. We're like, look, if you say the person's not qualified and they come back and tell you they still want to buy, great. Like, we're willing to sell to you, but don't want to overemphasize time in this. So that was one example. I'll work through a more complicated one, and then we're going to work through one together. So the other major company that I worked at that I used for this was a company called Compete. It was a market research firm, and so what we used to sell was subscription services to research reports and custom research. What we would do is we observed people's online behavior. So we would sell to companies that generally had very large websites where they were doing a lot of sales, and we would show them how people moved through their website and how that compared with competitors, because we had a panel of people who could watch their behavior online. this product would cost between $500,000 to $1 million a year in services. And I'll start out with the authority one, which is typically the people we would sell to would be the heads of their website or their online team. So the easy question on there was just identifying these are heads of So we got people on the phone. We would ask questions about what's your role, what do you do within the organization. And again, this was a little softer. It wasn't as firm as this. We had a general sense of who we tended to target. Budget's $500,000 to $1 million on this. This is an expensive product. We could try asking, in round numbers, what's your budget for market research? We could ask that. A lot of these folks, though, didn't have, we were doing this in the early days where people didn't have a market research budget set aside. And a lot of you sell products where there's not a pre-existing budget set aside for them. So we need to think about, were they likely to be an organization that could afford this? What do you think some proxy questions might be? Yeah, revenue. In particular, company revenue? Yeah, so company revenue was certainly a proxy. In this case, we were dealing with mostly the large telcos. At the time, there were 5 major wireless providers. All their revenue was in the billions of dollars. So we knew, if someone got on the phone with us, revenue was only an issue if you got into really small local providers, like the Crickets of the world and folks like that. So generally, we had a sense, even before they called us, of the company revenue.
So then you're looking at the division revenue.
Yeah.
That you're selling it to.
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, it would be the online team. People didn't want to say how much revenue they were making off their websites. What are other clues to revenue?
How big is your team?
Yeah. So that was a huge one we used to ask, is how many people? I forget what the cutoff was different at different points in our price history, but I think we discovered these often ended up being disqualifying questions rather than buying questions. Like, I can't tell you if you would buy over a certain amount, but below a certain amount, I know you won't. People who had divisions that were less than 10 people never bought. There just wasn't enough extra budget left over in it. What else? What else might be other questions?
Maybe number of customers, if they would share that.
Yeah, they tend to be pretty private about. Had done the same chain you went down. What was the chain you went down before for this one? Yeah.
Forgot.
Does anyone else remember? Yeah, similar products. So what do you imagine some similar products might be in this case? Was it?
Like Google Insights.
How would you frame that as a question for them? Because I want you to start thinking the questions that you can ask prospects that they could be able to answer.
How are you currently getting market insight?
Yeah, okay, so how do you currently get market insight? Basically, it's some version of trying to figure out the pain that you're addressing. How do you currently solve this problem?
Have you worked with companies like this before?
Yeah. Now, hard when they don't know what your company does or you're coming in as a new startup where there aren't easy comparables. So what might be a broader version of that question? Or actually, I'm pushing. You asked it as a closed-ended question, which is, have you worked with other companies like us before, which has a yes-no answer to it. Just convert that into what would be an open-ended version of that? No. Yeah. What other and we'll talk about questions later on, but this question framing is actually important with the yes or no questions. We're going to try to make everything open-ended. So what other companies do you work with? How do you currently solve this problem? Also, an important question for need. And that tended to be our primary need question. How do you currently solve this problem? I have a sense of people would say things like, well, we don't at all. Or we've always wanted. In our case, this was, we're going to give you insight into how people are behaving on other people's websites, which was usually one that they didn't have any insight into at all. And so that was able to expose, like, oh, would that be useful for you? Would that be valuable? The hard one here, and as most of you have experienced, one of the hardest ones is timing. How do you imagine thinking about timing?
Have you looked at your fiscal policies for next year?
Yeah, so one of the big things on timing was budget cycle. So we'd ask about their budget cycle because we were a big enough product that you might have to put us into the budget cycle. So one part of timing might be, oh, you need to figure out your budget by this day. Let's work backwards to figure out where we are right now and how far we need. What are some other timing things?
You could ask them about upcoming events they might be going to, like CES was an event they would care about, like so that they can be prepared to present themselves.
Yeah, so events and launches were often things where they had a hard deadline that they wanted something or some information to be able to work from, that we could work backwards from that. Other things?
We've also seen in the space we work in that if they're using an existing solution, they're typically under a contract.
Yep.
So knowing when that contract ends gives us a sense of time.
Yeah, contract timing. Software, yeah. Yeah, that was product releases. That was a big one as well. So it was like, oh, you're going to roll out a revamped website and you're doing a major redesign that you want to get out before the Christmas buying season. So let's back up to talk about, okay, you'll need the data to be able to design that at a certain time.
Would you ever get into, how are your bonuses paid? Do you get quarterly or annual?
Yeah, so the way that tended to come up, so this is really good. This talks about need and pain. We talked about last time, like this is often an aspect of pain, is one of the big timing things was around hitting targets. So with the people we were closest to, we could often get down to that level, which is like, look, you need to hit a certain volume goal by this time. We have this information that's going to be able to do it. But it was essentially things like whenever they had targets and goals that had specific time frames on them. So timing is the hardest thing. Being able to create urgency, it can often be easy to find people who have all three of these things, and you get stuck on this timing aspect of it here at the end. So getting a set of questions that helps us get through and start to get at what would be these non-arbitrary events that have some value for you that we can work backwards for to be able to create some degree of timing need. There are often other qualifications that are specific to the company. So these four are essentially almost by definition universal. It is pretty much literally impossible for someone to buy if they do not have the budget, the authority, the need, and sort of timing, especially because they get to decide what the relevant timing is. But there are often other company-specific qualifications. For Testive, one of the big qualifications was because this is less of an issue now, but when we started out, it was important that the student have a computer with consistent access to the internet. If you were going away for the summer to somewhere where you didn't have good internet access, you weren't qualified to buy our product. For Compete, because we observed online behavior, we needed your website to have a certain volume of traffic for our data to be any good. And those are often hard ones because you can have people at your door who actually have all of these things, but even if they were to buy, won't be able to successfully use the product. And so to be really clear about what those are. Is someone willing to go through, I'd be curious to go through one of these for your company, and then we're going to do it individually. But I'd love to work through this with one person. I'm going to erase what's up here right now, so we want to get it down. And we can think about, as a group, what are some of the questions that might support this? Someone willing to volunteer? It's good. You saved Carlo, who again so we're going to go to. Okay, so tell us a little bit about your company.
So autonomy
Yep.
is what we do.
Oh. Yeah, thank you.
So autonomy provides media rights and content management services for film and TV companies. So companies need to manage the intellectual property rights associated with their content across 200 plus territories, 50 plus license types, and time. And in addition to tracking all of those rights, they need to store the content and deliver it. So from the rights to the content, we provide the end-to-end platform that helps them manage and monetize their content.
All right, so you're primarily going to be selling to media companies that own intellectual property. And roughly, what's the price? What's the price of this?
It scales with the amount of titles and storage on the platform.
Yep.
So if you have if you have 10 terabytes on the platform, it's what is it like a? We just
I'm looking for
pricing.
thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions.
Thousands.
Okay, so thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
All right, so it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. So I actually have a question then. Is budget a significant issue?
Yes.
All right. Is it because companies don't so price is always actually I want to separate this. Price is always an issue. The companies that you're selling to, what's their revenue typically like? Tens of millions, hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands?
We have several segments, but focusing on the small to medium size here, it's like 6 to 8 figures.
Okay. So I always have to do, so hundreds of thousands to tens of millions.
Yeah.
Okay, so at hundreds of thousands, you can imagine that budget might be an issue.
Yeah.
As we get into millions and tens of millions, price may still be an issue, but whether or not the company has budget is probably less so.
Yeah.
So what are some of the questions that you use to get a budget?
One we use is the number of titles that they manage.
Yeah, okay, yep.
It's not a perfect proxy, but it's a pretty good one.
And how does, so that helps you get at how much your price is going to be. Does that help you get at whether or not they can afford it? Yeah. So I want to separate, and it's really important that we think about budget is different than price. So budget is about ability to pay, not necessarily the prices. So this is critical to figuring out what price you're going to charge, but not necessarily their ability to pay. I guess with the exception of like if you have 10 million titles, you probably have a large enough company that you can afford this.
Yeah.
So what else? Said people have pushed back on budget before, or people have pushed back on the price before.
Yes.
Have you found folks where you have actually thought, I don't think you can afford this?
Yeah, definitely.
What are some of the signs that someone can't afford this?
So, as you were saying earlier about, I can't remember which variable it was, but under a certain number of titles is a definite cutoff.
Okay.
Right? They definitely don't have budget under a certain number of titles.
Okay. So I'm going to put it back up there with the same thing of under a certain number of titles. What we're trying to work on here, who are the people that we don't need to spend time talking to because they're not worth our time? Okay, so you're under a certain number of titles that there's no way the math is going to work out. Yeah. What else?
When they, some companies have they pick a very simple licensing method, so it's not complex for them, and they don't need something that's complex to manage it.
Yeah. Okay, so what's your licensing method? We're going to want something complicated here. And you start seeing, right, this is how okay, how does the specific problem that I'm solving, how does it relate to it? That also, I suspect, is likely to be about a need question here as well, right?
Yeah. Right. If they've optimized their licensing method to be, easy cut and paste, they obviously don't need it, but they also have likely optimized the rest of their business to be very lean and not have budget.
Yep. We similarly in the businesses, especially, but we were looking for places that were lightly disorganized. That was often a better buyer for it. a better buyer for us. Anything else on budget that you've found?
Current spend
Current spend on what?
on cloud infrastructure,
Okay.
other products that they license.
Yeah. So infrastructure spend.
So
And
we really
other
start
products.
talking about what are you using today, and if they say, oh, we've got this product for that, and we've got that product for that, you can do the mental math, and you're like, well, they're spending 5 times what they would spend on us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like this would be a cost saver, so we probably have budget for it.
Yeah. So a great example of like these proxy questions. The part we're working at is like thinking about what are these proxy questions that would suggest they're already spending this money. We could replace it with some product that we have.
Yeah.
What about
And a lot of people end up not having sophisticated solutions. but they
if you just
still
sort of keep the microphone just even a little between
Oh.
you? You don't have to, it doesn't have to be right up to your mouth. I just want the
Yeah.
web folks to be able to hear it.
So a lot of times people don't have a sophisticated solution,
Yeah.
but they might be like storing their hard disks in closets
Yeah.
full of, storing their content in closets full of hard disks. So they're still spending on hardware. So those kind of give us proxies
Yeah.
on how much they're spending.
Yeah. So how do you store it?
Yeah.
Other questions that people use for budget. We'll talk about more as a group. What about authority? This is often a hard one. Who's usually your typical buyer?
Yeah, we talked a lot about this one in the last class. So for us,
So it's usually a tendency whenever you ask someone if they have the authority to make the purchase decision,
Yes.
everyone says yes. So the question of do you have the authority to make this decision, actually it's useful if they say no, because actually it's so funny. I will say that when people say no, I think that is a sign they're lying, because almost everyone says yes when they don't have it. And as I'm thinking back on the times where people have said no, I actually thought like, I think you do and you just don't want to deal with me right now. So this is a really hard one to ask outright. So who tends to have the authority?
the person who tends to have the authority in the small to medium size is the boss.
Yeah.
It's
Boss being the
CEO.
CEO. Okay. So are you the CEO is often part of the reason it's so useful to go in at the CEO level is by definition we can sort of say that they will have authority over these things. What are some other questions you use to get at authority or things that you look for?
So if they are spending on other infrastructure products, who led the contracting with the last product?
So who made the purchase decision on similar products?
Conversationally, if you're on the phone with somebody, can you say, does the CEO constantly lean on you? You know, I called for her.
Yeah.
How'd I end up with you?
Yeah.
Is this like your quasi role? Does that help? And what does that tell you if they respond to that question?
I'm maybe not tease out the scenario a little bit more.
So you always go to the top?
Yep. Okay. So let's see. You go to the top. Okay. Then you get bumped down. Yeah.
How do you know where you're at when you get bumped down?
Yeah.
Like, does this person do this to you all the time?
Yeah.
Is that something you would ask somebody?
Yeah.
Because you're just trying to figure out where did I land?
Yeah. All right. So you've gone in high. You've been bumped down, which is not necessarily a bad thing because we know at least there's been some charge from the CEO. I'm going to ask the group in a second. The big thing I'll pick up on that one is even conversationally to try and keep them open-ended. So you, just the particular framing of this one was a closed-ended, oh, does this always happen to you? Do these always get kicked to you? And what I'd suggest on there is an open-ended of like, oh, why did the CEO send me to you? And just the open-ended so you can hear what people are saying to try and get some clues sometime. So to let them say something like, she always bumps everything to me, would be different than, media rights. So maybe you're talking to someone who's like head of distribution, and they're like, oh, media rights falls under my organization. Or actually, let's do someone weird. It's like head of marketing. And they're like, why? And they're like, oh, media rights licensing falls under my department the way we have organized things here. And you'd be like, oh, okay, that actually seems like a legitimate reason, versus if it was like, oh, I handle all the requests that come through the CEO, you'd be more likely to think, I don't think we've hit authority yet.
Right, got it. Thanks.
Who else do we know in order to come up with the decision?
Yeah.
Who else should participate?
Yeah. Who else do we need to, who else is involved? You'll often get a good list. You'll often get something that sounds like, oh, just me. I can make the call. And you really want to push on that one. Like, well, okay, yes, but in order for you to be able to make the final call, who do you need to talk to? And then you'll start getting a picture of that list. What about need? What's the big needs that you've looked for? So we've talked about them, which is if the licensing is complicated, if it's stored in a weird way, what are some other things that you do to get at need? Yeah. Yeah.
No matter where it goes, doesn't someone generally have to ask someone above them for approval? Like when I work at companies, like if I were to travel, I had to get my manager to approve. If my manager wanted to travel, he had to get his manager to approve. So it's like it always seemed to go up. I mean, I guess once you get to the CEO, but it seems like there's always going to be a bump up.
Yeah. So saying there's always going to be a bump up. So things to think about there is often that you are fighting to get access to that higher level person. Because it is very common, right, that the day-to-day decisions are made by someone, and especially if you're significant, you're gonna need the approval of them. If that is the case, that person higher up is the actual person in authority. So one of the things that you wanna be thinking about is,
Gotten a conversation with that person to begin with, would you then have to get authority to the next person?
so it depends. I think you're right to usually assume you're often talking to a person one level below the authority. It does sometimes happen that you don't. You have a comment?
Oh, I also want to add something back to authority. So in my experience, for a larger company, right, it's not about one person. It's really, you need to look at the organization structure. For IT-driven company, right, even, so all the business units will be like influenced, but IT control all the final budget. So I will try to ask, your company structure, how the purchase decision made. So they tell you, kind of share your company structure is centralized IT driven, then you gotta go talk to the IT person. It doesn't really apply to small business, small medium, but for large corporate, it's always like the funding
And to that, there's also the fact that some different level authorities will have different authorization on the budget. So sometimes we also ask, well, what is your maximum budget that you're allowed to control the operating costs, or is it more expenditure? So depending on their authority, they might have that wiggle room there.
Yeah.
And if not, you'll know where do you have this authority to then if it goes beyond their cap.
So one thing that's coming out of this that is really important to note, an important thing, is that knowing the organizational structures of companies is a critical part of the corporate selling process. Because the decisions are complicated and across things, at some point in your process, part of the questions you need to be asking are about how is your company organized? And everyone will almost always give you, or can often give you answers like, obviously, so-and-so controls this. And important for you to remember, and the language that I found really helpful to this was to remind people like, oh, I deal with a lot of companies, and everybody has a slightly different way that they organize the details. And just reminding people when you're asking what seem like obvious questions to them, that even though purchasing might have to approve things, the actual tasks that happen for purchasing to approve things are slightly different in every organization. So to really start adding to your sales process, not just these questions about what's your problem and how do we solve it, but part of the sales process understanding how do they actually go and buy it.
So what happens in a scenario when they themselves don't know who has authority? Because the last time they probably made a decision like this was a decade ago.
Yeah.
And that person's no longer the company. There's been a significant reorg, but they continue to use that product.
Yeah.
So, you ask for a meeting, there are 10 people who show up.
Yeah.
They're all directors, VPs, and whatnot. And they're all like, yep, this is great. And then that's where it stays.
Yeah. So first of all, on the qualification problem, this is an authority problem.
Yeah.
So we've narrowed down, it's like, oh, the problem we have here is that we have 10 people in this room and none of them are qualified because they don't have authority. You might be able to qualify, but the organization has budget, the organization has need. You might even be able to get to timing, although usually timing and authority are linked because it has to do with the timing of this person. So the best that I can give you there is you are now on the search for who actually has the decision making here. Rather than being on the search that we often think of, which is we often think of the sales search as the search for the person who needs this. It is not just the search for the person who needs this. It is the search for the person who needs it and has authority and has budget and has some sort of timing. So in that case, you have not yet fully qualified that customer. Do Carlo, and then I'll come back.
What if you have identified someone with a need but who doesn't necessarily have the economic decision power?
Yep.
Would you try to get his or her buy-in first before getting bumped up to the person?
Yeah.
Or should you go after the person who has the buying decision, potentially a need, an economic incentive to purchase your product, but is not necessarily the user of the actual product?
Yep. So Carlo's asking about ordering here. It's like, what if you've identified someone with need, but not authority. Do you go directly up? Do you work through the person? So the thing to come out of this is we do not yet have a qualified lead because we don't have authority. So the timing and your focus on this customer should be spent on getting to authority. And that's what the energy focus should be in terms of your work with them. Which strategy to use, that actually is different. And so I can't sort of say that a priority. You can imagine some organizations where buy-in's going to be really important before you go up, and other organizations where you could cycle forever with one person before they let you go up to the next level. The big thing to come out of this is, where I need to be spending my time is getting access to that person. Marcus, you had a question from online?
Yeah, and just a reminder, let's make sure we use the mic. Sorry, just a reminder, let's make sure we use the mic when we ask questions. So I have a question from online, relates to product being perceived as a cost or a revenue generator. I'm going to read it.
Yep.
Miro, can you speak to whether you think different approaches are useful if the thing you are selling would typically be seen as a cost center versus a revenue generator?
Yep. Yeah. So what I'm trying to do in my head is I'm trying to frame that around this idea of, is the person qualified? And so on the frame of qualifying, whether it's a revenue generator or a cost center, I think speaks to need. And have you found the person with the right need in the organization? Because if you're sort of debating between those two things, I think the underlying issue there is who needs it. In general, costs either need to, what do they need to do? They either need to generate revenue, therefore to pay for themselves, generate savings, therefore to pay for themselves, or allow the company to stay in compliance with legal or regulatory requirements. Sometimes the cost savings or revenue can be pretty abstract. The more concrete they are, the easier they are to sell. But you could imagine a thing that's like, this is an employee perk. This employee perk, we believe, is somehow going to decrease our turnover, which is going to lead to some sort of savings. But they have to be connected to one of those three things in some degree. So I think figuring out what the actual underlying need there is going to be your key, and then to think about what are the questions that get at that.
Let's go.
Thanks. This is a scenario-based question.
Yep.
We find ourselves constantly running or getting referred to the group that we're competing against. Do it yourself or use our service.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that an authority?
Yep.
Is that a budget? You know, what does that qualify as far as category? And then how do you get out of that?
Yeah. Well, the framework on this one is how do you get out of the people is to first recognize you are being referred to an unqualified lead. You're being referred to someone who can't buy. I presume because they don't have need. that usually if you'd go into the competing group, they would say, we don't need this because we can supply this on our own. This doesn't solve any pain that we have. So to recognize that your time talking to that group is not, this is about time allocation, is not well spent time. So either you need to convince them that they have a need and surface that somehow. Maybe possible, but probably unlikely. Or to think about my energy with this person needs to be spent not on talking to them, but on figuring out where in the organization I can actually find need. And the goal is just that when you're talking to people, there are people who will take your time. And it's tempting to believe, oh, the person who's willing to spend time with me is therefore a good use of my time, and that is not true. This is a case where that group is probably willing to spend a bunch of time with you if they work on the exact same problem. They're probably totally willing to take your meetings, ask you a high degree of detail about how you solve the problem, but they're not qualified. And so to stop using the signal of who wants to talk to me as how I spend my time, and instead using the signal of who's qualified. I'll give you the test equivalent of this one. We were selling test prep to folks, which is like, if a family wasn't qualified because they didn't have a strong need, I wasn't going to spend any time with them on the phone. But if they were an exact right match for our product, so if someone wasn't qualified and wanted to get off the phone, I'd be like, thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. Call us if anything changes. If someone had budget, authority, timing, and in particular, our need was that we were really flexible. So in this case, the qualifications were, if you were a student athlete who was being recruited as an athlete and needed a specific test score to be able to be recruited for a school, which is a weird thing that's all related to this college admissions scandal that you've heard about people buying access to schools. This was well known for years on people who did this, that there was this whole side door into schools via sports teams, because the coaches could directly, basically coaches could individually admit students in order to balance their teams. And there was a formula they had with the NCAA that basically said, your team needs to maintain a certain SAT score of the people entering. And it was like relative to how much scholarships you were giving. So coaches would often need to balance their teams with higher scoring SAT people who didn't need scholarships. And so they would often tell certain students, if you can get this score, I can admit you to Northeastern as a squash player. And so if those folks were on the phone, I would not let them hang up. Because I was like, look, I actually have the product that is perfect for you. But it was only because I knew and I was really, really clear about what the qualifications were. So I think we actually talked about timing a lot on the other ones. I want to give time for folks to work on this in groups. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to get into groups of 3. If you could pass this one around here. To get into groups of 3, I would suggest not working with people from your own company. And take about 5 minutes individually to fill out, there's 2 sides of this. So to think about what are, for your product, the signals that the prospect has budget, the signals that they have authority, the signals that they have needs, that they have the need for it, and the signals that there is some degree of timing. I'll have more for the back in a second. There's also 2 questions on the back here. Are there other qualifications that they should be thinking about? Are there other things that this customer needs to have in order for your product to be a fit? And then what are some questions that you want to start asking you haven't already been asking? So I suggest take 5 minutes to do this on your own, and then get together in groups and share this with each other, and help each other think through what are questions. If you've identified these particular signals of budget, authority, need, or timing, what are some, help each other figure out what are additional questions or things you could be getting at that would help you do this. So take 5 minutes to do it individually, and then get into groups of 3 and share, and we'll share for about 10 to 15 minutes. So what did people notice? What are some things you learned or surprised you? Some things like aha moments.
I think the aspect about timing you mentioned. So often this feeling of, well, the customer doesn't have some like endless timing or infinite loop of not closing a deal, but you said, hey, there's always kind of a criteria behind there. You just need to figure it out, even though it feels random, it is not.
Yeah, so this thing of like, the timing can feel random, but as you've seen some people kind of figure out some timing things, I was saying back there's this, it can feel like, oh, they could buy any time, and then it just seems random when they do buy. What I want to push you to do from thinking about this is like to think, no, by definition, the moment someone decides this is time, something has changed, and no one's going to buy anything until they've decided it's time. And so part of what you are searching for is like, what are the triggers that do that? And that whenever anyone appears to have randomly moved from not buying to buying, you want to be investigating that. Like, you want to be figuring out what's going on, because it can look like, oh, just something random happened. Something happened inside their head, and it's important for you to know that. What else?
For us, I feel like we're all doing more enterprise sales. I feel like for us, budget and authority had a lot of commonality between the three of us.
Yeah.
So it was really more the needs and timing where our conversation differentiated.
Yeah. What were some of the common themes across budget and authority?
For budget and authority, it was size of the company, so in terms of, was it profitable, was it public, how many people are working there? And then for authority, it was, where are you in the organizational hierarchy? Like, are you a director or CEO? And how many people are you overseeing?
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. So just I want to push you on this is like just starting to ask these questions as part of your process. That it's not just questions here on do you need this and what it would solve, but that for the sales process you also need to be thinking about questions that get at these things. Because again, this is about how you spend your time. This is about focusing your time on people who have the ability to buy, not just people who would potentially benefit from this. What else?
Just in speaking out loud, sometimes if you talk about things, what I came up with was oftentimes if you have the authority and you're talking to the right person and there's a huge need, budget is not an issue.
Yeah.
In terms of what I'm doing right now is that there's the markets that we're looking at and the people we're speaking with, they'll find the budget somewhere.
Right.
So that's what kind of came to my attention.
I think one of the interesting things from that conversation was, in your case, anyone with the need at the sort of organizational level already has the budget, right? Because you're dealing with a company that can already afford a dedicated company.
Right, so that's, so that was the kind of the point to that. So it's finding the authority for us.
Yeah.
The need is there now.
Yeah. And the thing I tell you is the thing of like just, and then how do you allocate your time? That it suggests that like, oh, it's actually worth a bunch of our time to try and get up to high authority levels, which is a good example of like, you can spend a little bit of time and, I'm trying to give an example here, is like, hard to move it into time, but it's like, oh, let's say I could spend a half day and talk to one junior person, and I could spend, 10 half days a week and talk to 10 people. That can feel more productive than spending a whole week to just get to talk to one person. But that actually the week to talk to the one person is more valuable if it's the person with authority. And then in reality, we know it's not really a week. It's maybe more like 2 or 3 months of ongoing little bits of work just to get into that senior person. And that's actually time well spent. Though it can feel hard because it doesn't yield things as fast as talking to more junior people in the organization. What else?
Well, one of the observations that we had as we go further up towards enterprise clients is that there could be these macro factors that have strong influence on timing, which have nothing to do with the product or the sale.
Yep.
So, for example, consolidation, layoffs, acquisitions, that seriously affect their buying cycles and even their appetite to take risk.
Yeah.
So I think timing is, in my opinion, the most challenging one to figure out.
Yeah. Timing is the most challenging to figure out because these other three, timing happens inside the heads of people. This is inside their heads. These are more objectively determinable. And so this is the one in general that people sort of struggle with forever. And that one definition of sales is creating urgency. That is actually what sales does. I will point out to you, that definition where you're spending your time creating urgency only applies once you have figured out these other three. And that to some degree, this is a class for startups, and I think of often startups in the sales process as partially being the journey to understand the things that we are talking about. So last week we said, like, who's the user, who's the buyer, who's the reviewer. Getting a clear picture of that is part of what it means to being in the process of getting a picture of that is part of what it means to be a startup. As you have a clear picture of that, that is part of the transition to an established company. The big transition that comes with qualification, and this is what I'll sort of end on here, is that once you can really clearly articulate these things, this is the budget that people need to have, and this is what it looks like when they have it. These are the needs that we do and do not solve. And so if people, more importantly, do not have this need, we're not a good fit for them. This is the authority of the person that we need to sell to, and these are the timings that work. Once those are clear, the big startup step is that that is when you can transition from founder-based sales into hiring sales professionals. So the big deal of getting these things really, really clear is that once you can articulate them clearly, you can bring in someone who is really good at just figuring out the answers to these questions and pushing timing that you can't do while you're still figuring out, for instance, what needs we solve. So while your company is still at the stage of like, well, you come in and we'll talk to you, and based on some triangulation of like, I know this thing is easy for us to do and that thing is hard for us to do, and we'll talk to anyone because we could solve a bunch of different needs. Really hard to transition that to professional salespeople because they just don't have the depth of product knowledge that you have and that ability to make trade-offs. But that once you can get these together, that's when you can move into starting to hire out a sales team. So that's part of why we work on this, and I frame you around this, is the ability to start getting really clear about these questions is when you'll hit one of your major transitional milestones. So I'm going to stick around here for questions afterwards, but I just wanted to close out the formal part of this. Thank everyone for coming today. I hope it was a useful exercise. It's always super neat to hear about your companies and the journey you're on. So thanks so much, and I hope to see some of you in November.